Hello, and welcome to the Geo Show. On this episode, we're going to talk about structure, but first, shameless self-promotion. In order to keep this channel running, I have to remind you to be like a friendly doggo and Tyler, the Schistcast Robinson, and head over to patreon.com/feegs to become a member. Members get exclusive Discord access, shoutouts, and much more. And while you're at it, peruse my Redbubble store for some cool Geo merch. And also, make sure you listen to the Schistcast. Last weekend, we covered geology and video games. New episodes drop bi-weekly. That was my shameless self-promotion. Now, on to the show. Stress and strain. Rocks are subject to stress, mostly related to plate tectonics, but also to the weight of overlying rocks. And their response to that stress is strain, or deformation. Stress within rocks, which includes compression, usually close to convergent plate boundaries, extension, usually related to divergent plate boundaries, and shearing at transform boundaries, where plates move side to side parallel to a plane. Rock that is stressed responds with either brittle or ductile strain, and will eventually break. Brittle is synonymous with elastic deformation, and ductile is synonymous with plastic deformation. I learned brittle and ductile, but the book uses elastic and plastic. The way a rock responds to stress depends on its composition and structure, the rate at which strain is applied, and also to the temperature of the rock body and the presence of water. This figure shows the varying types of response of geological materials to stress. The straight dashed parts are brittle strain, and the curved parts are ductile strain. In each case, the X marks where the material fractures. A, the strongest material, deforms relatively little and breaks at high stress level. B, strong but brittle, shows no plastic deformation and breaks after relatively little elastic deformation. C, the most deformable, breaks only after significant elastic and plastic strain. The three deformation diagrams on the right show A and C before breaking, and B after breaking. Folding. Folding is generally a ductile response to compressive stress, although some brittle behavior can happen during folding. An upward fold is an anticline. A downward fold is a syncline. The axis of a fold can be vertical, inclined, or even horizontal. In many areas, it's common to find a series of anticlines and synclines, although some sequences of rocks are folded into a single anticline or syncline. A plane drawn through the crest of a fold in a series of beds is called an axial plane of the fold. The sloping beds on either side of an axial plane are limbs. An anticline or syncline is described as symmetrical if the angles between each of the limbs and the axial plane are generally similar, and asymmetrical if they are not. If the axial plane is sufficiently tilted that the beds on one side have been tilted past vertical, this is known as an overturned anticline or syncline. Domes and basins are related to anticlines and synclines, except they are folded in 360 degrees. A very tight fold, in which the limbs are parallel or nearly parallel to one another, is called an isoclinal fold. Isoclinal folds that have been overturned to the extent that their limbs are nearly horizontal are called recumbent folds. If we don't know that the folded beds have not been overturned, then we can use less specific terms, antiform and synform. If the axial plane of a fold is at an angle to the horizontal, this is known as a plunging syncline or anticline. Large folds can have wavelengths of tens of kilometers, and very small ones might be only visible under a microscope. Anticlines are not necessarily, or even typically, expressed as ridges in the terrain, nor synclines as valleys. Folded rocks get eroded just like any other rock, and the topography that results is typically controlled mostly by the resistance of different layers to erosion. Fracturing and faulting. Fractures or joints typically form during folding, extension, and compression. There is no side-to-side movement of the rock on either side of a joint. A fault is a boundary between two bodies of a rock along which there have been relative motion. Faulting, which involves the displacement of rock, can take place during compression or extension. as well as during shearing at transform boundaries. In order to estimate the amount of motion on a fault, we need to find some geological feature that shows up on both sides and that has been offset. There are several kinds of faults, and they develop under different stress conditions. The terms hanging wall and footwall in the diagrams apply to situations where the fault is not vertical. The body of a rock above the fault is called the hanging wall, and the body of rock below it is called the footwall. If the fault develops in a situation of compression, then it will be a reverse fault because the compression causes the hanging wall to be pushed up relative to the footwall. If the reverse fault is at an angle of less than 30 degrees, then it is called a thrust fault. There are numerous thrust faults in the Rocky Mountains, and a well-known example is the McConnell thrust, along which a sequence of sedimentary rocks about 800 meters thick has been pushed for about 40 kilometers from west to east. If the fault develops in a situation of extension, then it will be a normal fault, because the extension allows the hanging wall to slide down relative to the footwall in response to gravity. Another situation is where the bodies of rock are sliding sideways with respect to each other, as is the case along a transform fault. This is known as a strike-slip fault because the displacement is along the strike, or the length of the fault. On a strike-slip fault, the motion is typically only horizontal, or with very small vertical component, and the sense of motion can be right lateral, where the far side moves to the right, or it can be left lateral, where the far side moves to the left. Transform faults are also known as strike-slip faults. In areas that are characterized by extensional tectonics, it is not uncommon for part of the upper crust to subside with respect to its neighboring parts. This is typical along areas of continental rifting, such as the Great Rift Valley in East Africa, or in parts of Iceland. But it is also seen elsewhere. In such situations, a drop-down block is known as a graben, German for grave or ditch, while an adjacent block that doesn't subside is called a horst, German for heap. There are many horsts and grabens in the basin and range area of the western United States, especially in Nevada. Measuring geological structures. It is important to be able to measure the strike and dip of planar surfaces, such as bedding planes, fractures, or faults. Geologists take great pains to measure and record geological structures because they are critically important to understanding the geological history of an area. I cover geologic measurements in my Isle Royale video. Special symbols are used to show the orientation of structural features on geological maps and will be a feature of a future video. Well, that's all I have to talk about structure. With that, please like and subscribe. I bid you adieu, and cheers.